Just about every Magic set had a few new keywords to show off. A lot of these keywords are just changed versions of older mechanics, and are therefore not really all that big a deal. However, some of these old mechanics have some issues. Whether it's because the mechanics are just far too limited, or have some major design flaws built into them, there are some mechanics that Wizards themselves considers a big mistake. Today, we're going to go over some of the worst mechanics Wizards has ever printed and that they'll never print again. Starting us off at number 10, we have Forecast. This was a keyword mechanic where, during your upkeep, you could pay a mana cost and reveal the card from your hand to get an effect, usually a smaller version of the card's effect, and you can only do that once per card with Forecast in your hand. So, what were the problems with this mechanic? The issue is how repetitive they were. Since using the Forecast ability didn't use up the card, you could just use it every turn if you wanted to. And since actually casting the card means you'd never use the Forecast ability again, you were often actually discouraged from even casting the card in the first place. In order to balance this out, Wizards gave all the Forecast cards pretty bad rates for their effects. This creates a different issue. The cards were just really bad. Very few of the cards actually saw any play, with one of the only ones that really did anything being Proclamation of Rebirth here. Its ability to get your mana value 1 creatures back was extremely powerful when combined with cards like Martyr of Sands, a 1-mana creature that lets you sacrifice it to gain 3 life for each white card in your hand. By looping this over and over, you can often gain too much life for your opponent to ever kill you. This is, of course, very boring to play against, and not a particularly dynamic strategy. This is a great example of one of the main issues with the design of Forecasts, namely how repetitive it is, and the fact that this is the only Forecast card that ever really did anything shows how hard it is to balance. It's worth bringing up another mechanic with similar issues while we're at it, namely Buyback. This is a mechanic that allows you to pay an extra cost while casting an instant or sorcery spell to have it bounce back to your hand when it resolves, rather than going to your graveyard. This mechanic has a similar issue to Forecast in how it creates very repetitive game states. But unlike Forecast, it tended to be far too strong due to being costed far too low overall. Cards like Capsize in particular are infamous for stalling board states for several turns in a row, or ending the game once the player using Capsize gets enough mana. This sort of infinitely repeatable effect is just incredibly hard to balance, especially when your opponent can't even use something like a removal spell to answer the card. And at number 9, we have Intimidate. This keyword makes it so that creatures can't be blocked except by creatures that share a color with it, or artifact creatures. This is a riff off an older mechanic, Fear, which will also never come back. Fear was identical to Intimidate, but only cared about black creatures rather than creatures that share a color with that creature. So, why was Intimidate a failed mechanic? Intimidate was supposed to be the most common form of evasion red and black creatures got, as they weren't supposed to get flying that often. Wizards spent some time trying to figure out what form of evasion to give the colors, and they went with Intimidate for a while, but it had a few issues. Namely, it was really inconsistent. For one thing, it got worse the more colors the creature was on had, which really discouraged putting the mechanic on multicolored cards. Even worse, the keyword was very uninteractive. There wasn't any way to play around it, and a lot of the time, there weren't really ways to build your deck to beat it. With flying, most colors have ways to deal with flyers. Either they have a few of their own flying creatures, or at the very least, have reach creatures. The only option for getting around Intimidate is using removal or playing artifact creatures for decks outside of those colors. Lots of formats just won't have any artifact creatures worth running, meaning that creatures might as well just be unblockable. On the other hand, in some matchups, it literally does nothing. If you're playing a black deck facing another black deck, Intimidate is basically just flavor text. This issue was ultimately solved by introducing a new keyword, Menace, that prevents a creature from being blocked except by 2 or more creatures. This is a form of evasion that adds way more counterplay and is far more consistently useful. Now that Wizards has a better form of evasion for the colors, there's no reason to ever bring the mechanic back. And at number 8, we have Shadow. This is a keyword where any creature with Shadow can't block creatures without Shadow, and can't be blocked except by creatures with Shadow. This is very similar to the flying keyword, but the additional downside here makes the mechanic far clunkier. Shadow just isn't a terribly interesting keyword, with very little decision making going on at all. Very few cards have Shadow, so the likelihood that your Shadow cards will be able to block anything is basically 0. So the only real thing to do with them was just attack with them every turn. For all intents and purposes, the cards couldn't block and couldn't be blocked, which isn't necessarily a huge deal, but it means there's very little design space with the mechanic. Blocking is sort of what makes combat in Magic interesting, so just removing that entirely from cards doesn't have legs as far as design goes. What makes Shadow even less likely to return is its place in the story of Magic. You see, Shadow creatures have a very specific backstory. The Plane of Wrath was an artificial plane that merged with the Plane of Dominaria. In this process, some races of creatures were trapped in between planes, and these races are the ones that got the shadow creature type. So not only is the mechanic not great from a gameplay perspective, it's hard to plop down creatures with shadow in random sets without creatures from the right plane, or else the Vorthos nerds online would get very annoyed. The combination of all these factors makes shadow very unlikely to come back outside of a few shoutouts here and there. And at number 7, we have Rampage. This is a keyword where, whenever a creature with Rampage is blocked by more than one creature, that creature gets +X/+X until the end of the turn for each creature blocking it beyond the first. So, if a creature with Rampage 1 is blocked by 2 creatures, it will get +1/+1 until the end of turn. If it's blocked by 3 creatures, it'll get +2/+2 instead. Basically, this is a keyword that helps creatures that get blocked by a bunch of creatures at once. The issue is that this barely ever happens. You see, your opponent knows that you have Rampage on your creature, and they can do the math to see if blocking is favorable or not. The end result is that they simply never actually block the creature, which means that it at least appears as if you never get any value out of the ability. Now, this doesn't mean that the ability is actually bad. Forcing your opponent to not multi-block is a form of value, but it does mean that players, particularly new players, will look at the ability and quickly find themselves disappointed. These kinds of bad beats make a mechanic a lot less popular, even if it isn't actually that bad. In actuality, the ability is just far too niche. Being better at combat alone isn't enough to make an ability worthwhile. Look at Bushido, a very similar ability. This simply gives a creature +X/+X until the end of turn whenever it blocks or is blocked. Bushido comes up far more often than Rampage, and it's still pretty underwhelming. Despite coming up far more often in combat, Bushido was wordier and generally less useful than other combat abilities such as Trample, Flying, or First Strike. Rampage came up even less, was even more complicated, and felt even worse to play with. Honestly, these kind of stat boosting mechanics just feel awful when they can't be used to push for extra damage, as that's when the stat boosts are at their best. From a game design standpoint, these mechanics are just poorly thought out. And at number 6, we have the infamous banding. This is another keyword ability for creatures, and the wordiest one yet. Banding allows any number of creatures with banding, and up to one without, to attack or block as a band. If they attack as a band, they're blocked as a band. Finally, you get to decide how combat damage is dealt amongst creatures in a band rather than its controller. Now, the issues with this mechanic are numerous. First off, it's overly complicated and puts most players off as soon as they read it. It raises questions that require extra digging to find out. Like, for example, if you attack with Benelash Hero and Stormcrow in a band, could a Grizzly Bear block them? The answer is yes. You only need to be able to block one creature in a band to block the entire band. On top of being complicated, the mechanic is also really bad. As in our last example, banding creatures with evasion with creatures without evasion makes your board easier to block. In fact, it makes your entire board easier to block, since your opponent needs less blockers overall to stop them all. It's worth noting that as bad as banding is, there's an even worse form of banding called bands with other. This is an even more restricted version of banding that only allows you to band with other creatures of a specific characteristic. This version of the mechanic is even less likely to return, as it ramps up all the problems with the mechanic to an even greater degree. And at number 5, we have Cumulative Upkeep. This is a mechanic where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put an age counter on the permanent with the Cumulative Upkeep. Then you have to pay the specific cost once for each age counter on the card, or sacrifice it. This cost is most often mana, but there are some cards with more interesting costs attached to them, such as Wall of Shards, whose upkeep cost was giving your opponent 1 life. Now, what's wrong with this mechanic exactly? The issue is that it was just really hard to balance. Having to pay more and more of a cost each turn meant that you would eventually have to sacrifice the card, and often sooner rather than later. This meant that the cards had to have huge upsides to be worth playing at all, and hitting the middle ground was almost impossible. This led to swaps of awful cards that would never see any play, such as Halls of Mist, a stacks effect that asks for too much mana and does far too little, or Juju Bubble, which costs way too much mana and does nothing but let you pay more mana to gain pitifully small amounts of life. Even more medium cards like Boldivian Fallen are hurt far too much for their extra costs. Fallen gets a big boost to its power when you pay its upkeep cost, an upside that's made cards far stronger in the past, but it's still not enough for the card to be even remotely playable. The issue is that it restricts what you can do on each of your turns far too much. You either have to choose between going down a card and losing all the mana you put into it on your previous turns, or you have to keep paying and not develop your board any further. There is a bit of space to come up with a fun design for this kind of card, but the cumulative aspect was just too hard to work with. Cards like Peacekeeper have an upkeep cost, but they don't increase over time, and that sort of downside is a lot more manageable and has more design space. Really, the ever-increasing aspect of this downside was just too hard to work with, especially when there's a far better solution sitting right next to it. And at number 4, we have Ripple. This is a mechanic where, whenever you cast a spell, you reveal the top X cards of your library. You can cast any spells with the same name as the spell without paying their mana costs, then you put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This is a mechanic that's very hard to design for several reasons. First off, this is a mechanic whose performance varies widely in Limited and in Constructed. In Limited, you only have 40 cards in your deck, and you can also play any number of cards as long as you draft enough of them. So, if you open 6 copies of Surging Dementia, you can play all 6 copies. This makes the math on your Ripple spells much better, as you're looking through a larger portion of your deck and you have more hits. In Constructed, however, Ripple basically never works, as you're very unlikely to ever hit another one of your Ripple cards in your 60 card deck. Combine this with how weak the Ripple cards have to be on their own to make sure you can't just play them and be okay with whiffing, and you have a mechanic that just doesn't work in Constructed. The issue is that you can't make the math better for Constructed formats without messing up Limited. So the mechanic has to either be Limited only, or be Constructed only and completely mess up Limited. Even without all these issues, Ripple just isn't a fun mechanic. It's literally a slot machine in the form of Magic decks. Sometimes Ripple does nothing. Sometimes it discards your entire hand, or bounces all your lands, or just burns you to death. The only really notable card with Ripple is Thrumming Stone, which gives all of your spells Ripple 4. By combining this with cards like Rat Colony that let you run any number of the cards in your deck, you could cast your entire deck of colonies all in one turn. While this is very funny, it's not a viable strategy, and there's not much more design space with Ripple as a mechanic at this point, so it's very unlikely to ever return. And at number 3, we have Epic. This is a mechanic where, whenever you cast a spell with Epic, for the rest of the game you can't cast any more spells. Then at the beginning of your upkeep for the rest of the game, you copy the Epic spell. Now, we've already made a whole video about this mechanic in our Failed Mechanic series, so I'll just give you the TLDR. As it turns out, playing a card that stops you from taking any more game actions for the rest of the game in return for one spell is both really unfun and bad. The opponent knew exactly what you were going to be doing every turn and could just play around it easily. They could spend all their turn trying to get around whatever it is your Epic spell did, and know that you couldn't surprise them. From a design perspective, there's a big issue. It's very hard to actually design Epic cards. The Epic spells need to be strong enough to do things on a number of different board states, but it also has to be able to close the game, since the player won't be able to do anything after they cast an Epic spell. Honestly, you probably don't need me to explain to you why this mechanic is so terrible. I've never seen anyone who's read Epic and then said, man, that seems like a great idea. The issue with mechanics are pretty obvious, but they get even worse the more you think about it. And at number 2, we have Landhome. This is a keyword that we put on creatures in combination with the basic land type. For example, Plain Home, Swamp Home, and of course, Island Home. This now defunct keyword did 2 things. First, if you controlled no lands of the appropriate type, you had to sacrifice the creature. And secondly, it couldn't attack any player who didn't have a land of the appropriate type. Island Home was by far the most common form of this ability, mostly due to the fact the mechanic almost totally existed for flavor reasons. The idea was that it was given to creatures that could only exist in certain environments. Since aquatic creatures can only exist in water, they had to stay in islands. While this was very flavorful, it was maybe the worst idea for a mechanic imaginable. Making it so that your opponent has to be on one of 5 colors in order for your creatures to do anything at all is unbelievably limiting. Most of the time, it means that cards have a harder to get rid of version of Defender. The additional downside of making it so that creatures instantly die without a certain type of land on the field isn't amazing, but it wouldn't matter very often. It's not too difficult to make sure you're running lands with basic land types, and your opponent won't be able to interfere with it most of the time. The fundamental issue is that most of the time, the creature the mechanic is on simply won't do anything, and it's just too difficult to balance. Having to hope that your opponent happens to be running the right colors is just way too much to even try running the cards. And as bad as the mechanic is, I think there's one that Wizards will be even less keen on coming back to. And at number 1, we have Companion. This is a mechanic where, if you meet a card's companion requirement during deck building, you can reveal it from your sideboard at the start of the game. Then you can pay 3 mana during your sorcery to put it from your sideboard into your hand. Now, if you're reading the card on screen, you'll notice that it says something different. That's because the entire mechanic had to be errata to make it less broken. The ability to always have access to an 8th card and to be able to build around that card ended up being way too good. It made it far too easy to win the late game. Cards like Loras and Yorion had to be banned in Modern, as well as having several other companions banned in other formats. Loras was the most powerful of the bunch. Its requirement only asked you to run all permanents with a mana value of 2 or less. making it extremely easy to fulfill and lets you cast a permanent spell with a mana value 2 or less on each of your turns, getting you a ton of card advantage. The issue was just how little downside there was to running these cards. One of the reasons why Loris and Yorion were banned was that basically every deck that could possibly play the card did play them, since you just didn't lose anything. If the game did go on long enough, you could play them and get a ton of value, and it would often be enough to win you the game. This much free value on a card that only costs you a single sideboard slot was way too much, to the point where even after being errated, several of them still needed to be banned. Making this mechanic not broken is pretty much impossible, as the cards are basically always either like Loris or like Umori the Collector, which is to say completely unplayable. Wizards will almost certainly never revisit the mechanic. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other mechanics you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.